Welcome to the Raise podcast. I'm Carol Barwick. We're here to raise your confidence and inspire your creativity. Each episode, we will have a different guest who will be discussing our Raise word. The Raise word is a word that will encourage you or empower you and at times inspire you to explore the word a little more for yourself. Well, hello everybody and welcome to the Raise podcast. I'm Carol Barwick. We are in season 4 of the Raise podcast and we're going to be celebrating lots of things around poetry this episode with the brilliant Laura Baldwin from Laura Speaks. She's going to be talking to us and sharing poems with us, and we're going to look at the word promise. So without more ado, let me introduce you to Laura. Hi, Laura. How are you doing?
Hi, Carol. I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Laura, before we dive into promise and what that can mean and how poetry and words help us to unpick that a little bit, tell me what the word promise means to you.
Yeah, so promise is it's something that's been on my heart quite a bit for the last few weeks. I've been using the word promise for a long time. I stand on the promises of God, and I've had lots of things happen in the last 6 years that I've really needed to stand on the promises of God throughout them. So it's a strong word for me. But recently we've been exploring some memory verses in our church and just really leaning into certain verses. And it's really brought up the word promise to me again and again. Both going forward, stand on the promises of God, but also looking back at how those promises have come through in my life, particularly in my career with the poetry. Yeah, and I had a business that closed down, and at the time it felt like the end of the world. And when you look back now, you can see that standing on those promises of what was to come was really what got us through. And yeah, there was a lot to come that I had to deal with that was worse, shall I say, worse than the end of a business. So it kind of prepared me for that. So yeah, I feel like promise is my word for this year, particularly because it just keeps coming back in certain things. Yeah.
Love that. And it sounds like it's a very anchoring word. And I think you're absolutely right. We forget about the promises that have kind of happened already. I don't think we forget about promises that have been made in the past, but often that's a negative. So you promised to do that and you never did, kind of thing. But actually remembering the promises that did come to fruition, the things that were done when somebody promised to do them, I do think we do forget about that. And the same in promises for the future and that trust and hope that can come from that. I'm looking forward to finding out more about what that means for you. So, Laura, tell us a little bit about your background and where kind of God's promises have kind of started off for you. Tell us a little bit about Laura Baldwin.
Yeah, so I was born in Bradford at St. Luke's Hospital, and I've travelled around the country since. Not extensively, but I've lived down on the Isle of Wight for some time as a child, and then I lived in the northeast before we returned to Bradford. So I've lived around, been around a bit. And for my teenage years, I was living on a council estate in Bradford. I was the eldest of 3 kids in a single parent family. Yeah. So I had a lot of opinions, and I liked to write a lot as a child, but I didn't actually envisage myself as being a writer until, as I said, my business closed down and I really lent into that. But it was something that had been spoken of me for a long time. Yeah.
Brilliant. And have you got any poems around that time or the moving around?
Yeah, sure. I've got a poem called My Voice that explains a little bit about why I speak the way I do. My accent is a bit odd. It changes and I say things differently at different times. Yeah, I've got a poem about that.
Excellent. Thank you.
My voice. My voice changes, moves around, different dialect, different sounds from different playgrounds in different schools, different regions, different rules. See, if you travel around as a child, your voice runs wild. You pick up different dialects, and then you are left with a mashup of regions, and that's the reason for this voice. It's not a choice. I can say the same word 3 times, and it will sound different with every line. I'm not kidding. Even my Google Assistant thinks I am my daughter, and sometimes it just says, "Hello, Laura." How can I sound different on different days, in different hours, different ways? Some people are bound to think I fake. I mean, everyone has a phone voice, right? But mine changes from deep to light without me consciously trying. I'm not lying. See, I can suddenly become very southern, posh, where lunch and dinner are how you eat nosh. And then other times Yorkshire dialect creeps in and I begin to speak using words like nah and then. And dinner and tea are the meals we eat. I've even been known to adopt the Geordie where my voice goes all light and haughty and I end up on a high like Divney lie. But usually it's far more subtle. The tone just changes a little. And people say, why do you not sound like you? Why don't you just be yourself? But this is me. I am trying to be myself. It's just myself is a mixed bag of leftover bits and bats from living in one end of England to the other and back. I left Yorkshire when I was just a few years old and lived down south till I was 9. By the time I was 10, I'd left, and then I lived in the northeast with a Geordie twang. How and way I man. But at 13, I returned to Bradford and I got stuck with this accent. It's neither here nor there. It's no classical speaking voice, but neither did I fit on the council estate boss. And the weirdest thing of all is don't sound like my sister, brother, or friends at all. I have, however, found that I do sound like someone I know quite well. I sound like me, and that is all I need to be.
Oh, I love that. That says I do have a little bit of an issue because I used to live down south as well. I think I must have been really posh because we had breakfast and supper, darling.
Oh, yes, that is a whole new level.
And then I worked in Bradford for 10 years. So I then had to change my accent quite rapidly because I remember one of the first things that I went to order in Bradford was a tuna mayonnaise and a Coke. I didn't know what I was asking for.
I remember when we moved up to Newcastle, my sister, we were in a shop and my sister turned to my mum and said, "Are we in Newcastle now, mummy?"
You
Everyone
just
in the
feel,
shop just looked at her.
yes, you suddenly feel very like you're really sticking out, don't you? It's
Yeah.
but yeah, wonderful. And how do you feel that God's promises have kind of followed you around from the south and northeast and Bradford?
Yeah, I come from a family that we didn't have any faith growing up. So
Yeah.
that the most faith we had, I knew that my mother had had some involvement in a church when she was young, and she used to help lead the kids' work, the Sunday school when she was 18. But we weren't raised in a faithful household. Um, the most faithful we were is that we had a huge argument one day because my sister defaced my Bible that I'd been given as a christening present.
Oh,
We'd been christened, but that was it. There was no real input. We didn't go to church or anything like that. However, I did go to Church of England primary schools. I went to various primary schools with moving around, and I did go to a couple of Church of England primary schools, and they would have churches attached, and the vicar would come in and do talks to the school as a whole or as a class. And there's one in particular that just really has never left me, and it was strangely enough, it was weird. It was because he was talking about Christmas and how we shouldn't abbreviate it to Xmas.
okay.
Never left me because he was saying like you're taking the Christ out of Christmas. And now as an adult looking back, I can understand the message more.
Yeah.
But as a child, it really stuck with me, and I was really intrigued to find out more. And I would quite often read this little christening Bible that I had, this little gold leaf Bible that was in a box.
Hmm.
And I didn't understand it. I didn't know what I was reading, but it just there was something there. And again, it goes back to that seeking. I was seeking even as a child,
Yeah.
and that carried on through my teen years. I was a bit of an unruly teen in the end. I started off quite well, but I ended up pregnant at 18.
Right.
So yeah, I'd made mistakes, and yeah, when my son was 18 months old, I found myself single parent to a young child, and I went along to a mother and baby group. in Bradford. And from there, I was invited to their church service, where I had a moment where I just felt like the pastor at the time was just speaking to me directly, and I just felt like God was just speaking to me. And I was saved in that moment. So then I was baptized, and then I went on a journey. Yeah, I went on a journey, shall we say?
Mm.
Yeah, but they were the promises that had been there all through, and still are. You know, I look back, and those promises were throughout my childhood, even in a family where we weren't Christians and I didn't have that input. God was there, and quite clearly there at times.
As I said, I wanted to use this to kind of celebrate World Poetry Day as well. And as you know, Laura, I'm a real wordy as well. And I was just that little bit excited when I discovered that the word poem was in the word promise. Slightly
Yeah,
tenuous, perhaps. But I feel that this is the way that this episode is going to be led. So I'm really excited about it. Can you start by telling us a little bit about what happened around the business, and what brought you really into having poetry as a career?
yeah, sure. So it's quite random, but I used to own a milkshake bar, um,
Cool.
in a small market town in West Yorkshire, and it was successful to a certain extent. And unfortunately, my health meant that I got to a stage where I just couldn't. Well, I say it was successful, but it wasn't successful enough to bring enough money in to pay somebody to run it for me.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I got quite poorly, and so I had to had my brother running it for me. But unfortunately, it just wasn't making enough money to pay us both. And so I had to make that decision, which felt like cutting off an arm, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was in February 2017. So it feels like forever ago now. An awful lot has happened in the world since then.
Mm.
But yeah, making that decision to close down the business was really difficult. We'd become, after 6.5 years of being open, my husband and I had run it to start with, and then he'd gone back to work, and it was just myself and my brother. And we'd become really well known in the town. And so it was really difficult season of changing from seeing people every day, to suddenly being at home, unwell, not being able to really get out much, and never seeing anybody. And it felt like I dropped off the edge of a cliff, and nobody had noticed.
Right.
And I went through a season of really discovering what it means to be isolated, and how we have to step into the promises. We have to actually seek God. We have to seek what we want. Things don't just come to us. And so I went through a whole season of that. It was a difficult time, but then things went from bad to worse. When my son, it became apparent that he had become addicted to drugs, and we had a family intervention, and he went to a Christian rehab centre called Battelle,
Mm.
and he spent the best part of a year there. So that was a really trying time. It
I
was
bet.
really, really difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, dealing with all of that really was just, yeah, just it was just so much. It was so much to be carrying at the time. And my health was just declining. I didn't know why. And then I was diagnosed with a chronic condition in 2018. I didn't know I'd always had, a chronic illness, sorry. Yeah, and it kind of it's just moved on from there really. There's been lots to deal with during that. And then obviously the pandemic hit. Um,
As if that wasn't enough. Yeah.
as if we hadn't been dealing with enough.
Oh,
Yeah, I
Laura.
mean,
Wow.
we jokingly say in our family, we've got two daughters as well as our son, um, who are both now teenagers, the girls, and our eldest daughter, who's autistic, she had a real special interest in a certain band at the time, and we bought tickets for them for Christmas. So we were going to go to Dublin. And then I remember saying, and it's a joke now in the family, and she said to me, "We will definitely be going to this, right? Nothing's going to stop us going." And I said, "It would have to be the end of the world for us to
Oh
not do this
no.
thing." And then the pandemic hit.
Oh dear.
So we were like, it kind of is. So it's a bit of a long running joke now. She's over it now, but it
Oh gosh. That sounds like a lot to manage and come to terms with. Um, I I understand to an extent because uh, when COVID did hit, my business was probably doing the best that it's ever been. And
mm,
then when I got COVID and then started developing long COVID,
mm,
suddenly I wasn't able to do all the things that I normally did.
yeah,
Um, and you question, don't you? You do question, it really powerful what you said about feeling like you'd fallen off the edge of a cliff and no one had noticed. I
yeah.
mean, I wonder how many other people have felt like that before. Um, we are going to really get into some of your poetry. Have you got any poems that kind of reflect that time for you?
Yeah. So how I got into poetry was because I've always written from being very young,
Yeah,
but obviously writing is a very cathartic process. And so during all of this, I found myself writing more and more and more, particularly around the time that our son went away. Um, I just felt like it was the only real way that I could process what was happening.
yeah.
Yeah, I wrote this poem about my son going away. It's called Heartbroken. My heart is broken, torn in two. That is to say, it is shattered into a million fragments that pierce the breath as I gasp for as I wake, with fright from slumber remembering in the night. The nausea rises. Pain is hiding a deeper emotion I can't even name. Pain that crushes my throat. Constrictor, conflictor, evil creeper into my thoughts against all I've been taught. Sheer desperation calls out again, but no sound is heard. A hidden blessing for all around, as no one should ever have to hear the sound of a soul tearing, stretching, contorting. Anger ensues, fierce, loud. Everyone enemy, trust abandoned, proud. Stay far from me, this is contagious. It is not mere heartbreak, nor pain, nor sadness, but feeling indescribable, wretched, all encompassing feeling so abhorrent it has no name. It can bear no title. It does not deserve to be described, yet description is the only cure. To release in language its grip is to live again once more.
Wow. Thank you so much. Um, those feelings that you must have been having while you wrote that, um, and the way that it's come out onto the page and through the microphone today. Um, yeah, again, I'm sure there are people that feel that. Um, take us a little bit through the hope and the promises that you have seen come into fruition since that kind of really dark place.
Yeah, I think it's only really this year in 2024 that I'm really starting to process what has happened um, from the viewpoint of being on the other side of it and really how promises work, particularly the promises of God. Um, and just my journey with God and how at times I felt lost, I felt alone, I felt very isolated. Um, I felt that God had left me at times. He wasn't answering my prayers in the timing that I was expecting. Um, and so it felt very difficult. But now in this year, I'm really starting to focus on how those prayers have been answered in ways that weren't necessarily expected. Um, yeah, and just the memory verses that we've been looking at about asking, seeking, knocking, actively looking for God. There was a time when I thought I was walking with God, but I wasn't. Um, and yeah, I feel like the promises now, it's about looking for that. It's about looking for that hope. And that really feeds into what we were saying about that isolating feeling of suddenly being without the business, without being everything that I put my identity into. Where was the hope? And I realized over time that I had to go and find that. It's not something that just comes to you. You have to go and find it. You have to actively seek it.
What a treat to hear from Laura today. If you are enjoying this episode or any of the others that you've listened to, please do go onto your podcast platform and give us a rating. It really helps us with our visibility. And we just wanted to say that this year Raise is going to be 10 years old in April. So do look out for the birthday promotions that will be going on in our Facebook community group and across our socials. Back to the episode. So Laura, we were just talking about actively seeking hope. Have you got any poems around that?
So yeah, I have a couple of poems around that. And I have one that I wrote recently that I could read for you. It's a new one. This one's called Until He Calls Me Home. Excuse me. The best meal I ever had was the day I bit my tongue, and the taste of iron filled my mouth, leaving my lungs gasping for air. That day made me acutely aware that we are temporary, one tongue between two sets of teeth gnashing at our lives. And all the striving and writhing is pointless but necessary. Staying afloat just to watch the boat pass by, eyes above the waves, staving off the sword of the enemy, wearing battle armor too heavy. But since that day, I've learned with every injury, every singe and pain, he refines us. We may be in the fire, but we are made in his image, precious metal. So we are damaged, but made pure through the refining process, purifying to emerge success, the proverbial phoenix, better than before. So we pick ourselves from the floor, demand more. To get closer to the sun, we are scorched, but impurities are removed. And each time faith moves mountains and our walk with God is closer, stronger. I pray it will be long, a demonstration of how strong we are through him. When I am weak and my bleak outlook sees cloudy skies, another storm on the horizon, my God sends a painted sky of all the colours rising to promise hope until he calls me home.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I wanted to just share something. The episode that I did before was the word ridiculous. And I love that, particularly in the faith community. God often steps in and does something ridiculous. And that's when you know that it's kind of a promise fulfilled, or that it's going to be a promise fulfilled. And when I was younger, my mum had a kind of a word for me, a word from God. And it was that my fluff was going to become like gold. So that kind of refining that you were talking about in your poem. And I was like, what? Like, fluff? Fluff is going to become gold. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Now, that was around the time, Laura, when, I don't know if you remember, but you could win all kind of things in the packets of knick-knack crisps. Do you remember?
Yeah.
There was a really weird campaign. You could win all kinds of things. And that day, I bought a packet of nice and spicy knick-knacks, and I won a piece of fluff. Now, for everybody else, that would be like, oh, like, you know, whatever, what a ridiculous thing. But for me, that was like a promise that was going to happen, because why would you ever win a piece of fluff? And
wow,
yet
that's amazing.
it really was amazing. And that's what I love about God's promises. And you were saying, you know, it's really just been this year that you've seen him starting to answer, and it hasn't looked like what you thought it would. And again, I think that's when sometimes it's hard to trust in God's promises, because you know that it's not going to look the same, and you don't know how it's going to look. And you were talking about asking and seeking and knocking, and it is so important that we do that. But sometimes his answers are so different. So what is it that you think we need to do in order to see those promises?
Yeah. I think I think, as I said, I think I'm realizing now that it is the seeking.
Yeah.
It's all in the seeking. Um, God doesn't move. He's unmovable. He's always there. He doesn't leave, I mean. And I think it's important to remember that whilst he is constant and there, if we don't step into it, we don't experience it. So the promises are there, the promises haven't changed. But if we don't step into it, if we don't step in and read the word and pray and spend time in fellowship, if we don't do those things, we're not going to see promises fulfilled. And we're not going to see real relationship with him. So that's really something that I'm on a journey with at the moment. Because I would have considered myself as being in relationship with God for a long time. So it's kind of a new thing, but also not. It's something that I've always known, but it's just not something that I've really pressed into. But I think that's how we find the answers, the promises fulfilled. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I wonder, for people that we read about in the Bible, how many were given promises that at the time they didn't understand, that were given these
yeah,
amazing words that we read in the Bible and we're immediately, wow, that's amazing. But it must have been, for someone like Moses being faced with a burning bush and being hearing this word of God, as amazing as it was, there must have been a part of him that thought, I'm really not sure about this. Is it real? Is it really burning? Is it in my mind? All those kind of doubts and things that come
yeah,
in. And the promises, and I would struggle with things like this, like that are going to be in the wilderness for 40 years. Like, who wants a promise like that?
yeah,
And yet we see it being lived out. And then what's happened as a result. And I wonder if God's promise is as much actually the learning, that it's the promise of the learning and the conquering and the going through, as it is the victory and the end result.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and for me
yeah,
personally, I've always found that the promise is mainly that he is there, that he is with us,
yeah.
um, and that has been a real refuge to me. In fact, I have a poem called Refuge, um, and it is about how God hasn't left me, how he is the place that I turn to, the one that I turn to when in difficulty, when struggling, and
Oh,
also times of praise as well.
yeah. Oh, please, will you share refuge with us?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
I run to you, tower of refuge. Shelter me not just from those who wish me harm, but from this world and all its charms. Help me not succumb to the beating drum of the snare, catch my tears as they fall, stroke my face whilst I pretend not to care. Stop me, still my beating heart. Don't allow temptation to start. Stop it before it begins, carve out what lies within, mix a salve for my skin. Soothe burns and stings, scald away the coldness and freeze the burning desire. Then make for me a warm place beside a crackling fire. Wrap a blanket around my loneliness. I cannot tell apart the fireworks from the stars. Shave a sliver of my life, reveal the pale moonlight, melt the silver, and when restoration comes, I will worship you still.
Laura, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful. That imagery, so much beautiful imagery. I mean, what we'll do is we'll make sure, if with your permission, well, we'll certainly put about your poetry book in the show notes. But if we could maybe share a couple of those poems as well. But the imagery in that one is it's just beautiful. It's really tender, isn't it? And
Yeah, thank you.
it
I
shows
have,
how much of a relationship,
yeah,
God has got with you.
Yeah, I have recently been using that poem with children in secondary schools. Um, been doing writing for wellbeing workshops with the National Literacy Trust,
Oh,
and
brilliant.
that poem's been really helpful in reaching young people. Yeah, and I didn't think it would be because of the imagery. I thought that perhaps it might be a little bit too abstract, but it's worked brilliantly. Actually, they've people really seem to relate to that. Yeah.
I think it's got beautiful metaphors and things that can be, now talking a little bit, from a teaching background, that it can be emulated really well, that like the fireworks into stars and the blanket. You see, I've not got it in front of me, Laura, but I can remember it.
Yeah,
And the
that's
the face being stroked tenderly, it very, very clear images. Tell me a little bit about these wellbeing workshops, because that sounds fantastic. And what was the response from the young people that you worked with?
yeah. So I've recently been training with well, second half of last year I was training with the National Literacy Trust with a qualified psychologist and poetry therapist. She's been teaching us how to facilitate workshops in writing for wellbeing, which are very different to the workshops that I've been doing for a long time with just writing poetry workshops. Um, Writing for wellbeing is different in that we are not focusing on the output. We're not focusing on what we're going to create from it. We're not
Yeah,
focusing on the how the logistics of it and how we're going to create something. It's more about our responses. So the selected poems that I will use, and we'll read them as a group, and then we'll delve into our responses and how those poems make us feel. If there are, like, you've just straight away come straight back at me with some of the things that really stood out to you. So
mm,
that's what we were doing. We were just looking at the poem. Everybody sort of feeds back what stood out to them. And then we would use that as a prompt for you to write your own piece that you don't have to share with anyone. It's just about getting things on the page in that cathartic process of dealing with what life throws at us.
yeah. I think that's so important, and that it's that permission to express, isn't it? And as you said, I think when you take away the need to produce something perfect in a literary sense, you can express freely, and I think that's so important. I remember writing raps with young people, and it just flowed, the
Yeah.
pain and the stuff that they had never told teachers, and probably not told parents, just flowed onto the page because it was all there, but they thought they were going to have to express it in a perfect, um, beautifully content kind of way. And it's like, no, I'm not interested in that. I just want you to express it. And so thank you for doing those workshops, because I know how much of a difference they make. And that's really exciting. So you're doing them at the moment. Did you say you're offering them through the National Literacy Trust?
Yeah, it's been a project through the National Literacy Trust that are they are actually rolling it out nationwide. So they had a first cohort of poets doing it last year in the south, and then they've had a second cohort this year. So I envisage it will carry on. Um,
Mm.
I do my own writing for wellbeing workshops independently, but they were specifically for secondary school. The ones that I'm doing are online on Zoom, but they are for adults. Yeah, and they're not particularly faith-based, so there doesn't have to be a faith involved. You can come from any background. um, yeah, and it's not for writers or non-writers, it's just for everybody.
Brilliant. That's the best answer. I love that one. Yeah, just for everybody.
Yeah,
One of a recent podcast guests, Kate Campbell, was talking about wonder, and just that space to, again, as we were just saying, space to express.
yeah,
And so we kind of come to the part of the podcast, Laura, where we kind of challenge those listening. Um, and so I think what I want to challenge people with is that there's two things really. Is there a promise that maybe you don't think, don't believe that God has given to you, but someone has given to you that you can step into, that does look like it will move your life forward? Um, and how can you kind of seek that a little bit more intentionally. And also just to challenge you to express without worrying about the product. So if you've got a piece of paper, I used to write on a bus ticket, Laura, I don't know about you, but when the poem came, it came. And yeah, don't be afraid to just, express who you are and how you feel. Have you got anything to add to that, Laura?
I think it's taken me a long time because my day job is copywriting. That's what I do during the day, as if I don't write poetry during the day. But that's my bread and butter at the moment. And so I find myself constantly editing. And that is something that I had a fellow poet said to me a few years ago. You need to just share what you've written. Just stop kind of editing everything to within an inch of its life. And I still do edit everything to within an inch of its life, but I am getting better, and I'm trying to step into that promise of it will be okay. That it's, to share something that's raw is the way to go forward. And so I'm learning from the Writing for Wellbeing courses as well, that it's good. It is good to share what comes from that place, from the secret place. And yeah, I think it's still a journey I'm on, but I'm leaning into it.
Yeah. And I'm the opposite. I just write and share straight away, and I could probably do with editing things quite
I feel
heavily
like
at
you're
times.
much more talented than I am. I've heard you recently just off the cuff sharing some words that came to you, and I was like astounded. I could never do that.
Well, there's no pressure now because this is what I have to do right now.
Sorry, I'm adding the pressure.
We come to the part of the podcast where I am able to share a poem with you. And what I love about these poems that I'm given, and I do believe I'm given them, is that they are completely inspired by the guest. And it's been wonderful to share with you today and hear about God's promises that have been and will be for you, Laura, and the family. So I'm just going to take just a couple of seconds.
I'm really excited.
In the shallows, there's a promise, but you're going to have to step in, and you won't know what you'll find there. But the journey will begin, and you'll start to walk in deeper. You might feel that you will drown, but the promise, it's still there. And it's going to be around and about. And so you start to swim, and you get that bit deeper and that little bit further in. But the promise is still there for you. You might have to dive, and you might feel that it's not going to happen. You might not survive, but the promise is still there, and this treasure is within. And you just keep swimming deeper, and you hear the voice within. And the voice says, I'm the promise, and I'm living within you. And you know that this is water, and that you have been renewed.
Wow. Oh, wow, Carol, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And as I said, and I'm very much in this context today, and we don't always get to this level, but I love that we have. That was from God to you, very much so, and to those people listening today. Thank you, God, for that. Laura, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been just lovely sharing. And yes, thank you for all your poems. And I look forward to hearing what our listeners are going to do as a result of hearing this episode today. Laura, thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Carol.
Welcome to our bonus feature. We do these sometimes, and as you know, Easter is coming up, and so it's a lovely time to have a bonus feature. We're talking about the word promise, and we've really looked into all that it means. And Laura is just going to finish with a poem about the promise of Easter. However, your celebrating Easter. We hope you have a wonderful and blessed time of promise. Over to Laura.
Good Friday. As they led him away that fateful day, cast lots for his clothes, gave away his robe, crowned him in thorns, the crowd scorned. Less than a week since they cheered and laid down their cloaks with great hopes for their new leader, now mocked, flogged, they called for his murder. Crucify him, they cried. And Pilate sighed as the King of the Jews was crucified, the prophecy fulfilled, the Lamb was dead, his blood was spilled. But through the fear and dread, no fairy tale story, on the third day they watched the sun rise in all his glory.